mean to say, like, oh, this is the very best, and like English literature in the 18th century was the very, very best. Yeah, okay, probably. Like, or like in Scotland or during the Enlightenment or in Europe. Yeah, probably, because the conditions were such that people were free to think in ways that they hadn't before. But other societies also had great works. I am open to reading those, and I am open to teaching those. But I'm not open to like then needing to sort of downplay everything else, because I think, and this is an old-fashioned idea, but I think we're all human beings, and therefore, you know, the cultural heritage of humanity belongs to all of us.
Welcome to the New Flesh Podcast, the podcast you deserve. My name is Ricky Orpike, and joining me once again is my good friend, Mr. Jonathan Astro. John, how's it going?
Yeah, good. I got no complaints.
So we sort of have a new mission here, or maybe a side hustle for the podcast, and that is we're trying to make the left a little bit more glamorous. We have a very glamorous guest on today.
We do.
Miss Ashley Frawley.
Ashley Frawley is definitely, I don't think it's offensive to call someone glamorous, is it? Like, because I know we're in very touchy times. Like if I say, oh, you're so glamorous, but is that a sexual aggression, or?
I think maybe it could have been, or maybe when people actually did care about #MeToo, it would be.
Oh, but that
being as no one cares about that anymore.
We beat Me Too.
We did, yeah.
Oh, well, that's good. That's a win. You know what? We don't celebrate the wins enough. We beat Me Too. That's done with. But anyway, Ashley Frawley, definitely a wonderful speaker, intelligent, incredible talent, and yeah, y'all are going to love it.
Now, we always tell you the truth here at the New Flesh Podcast, and the truth is we need your help. We need you to leave us a rating or review wherever you listen to the show. We're also on YouTube, so please subscribe to our YouTube channel and leave a comment about the show you liked, or perhaps one that you didn't. Word of mouth is also a very powerful tool, so please tell all of your friends. And finally, to our Uber fans, if you love what we do, you can send us a little cash via the Buy Me a Coffee platform. Any donation here is very much appreciated. Now, on with the show.
Ashley Frawley, a senior lecturer in sociology and social policy at Swansea University in Wales, joins us. She is also a contributing editor of Compact. Her published books include Semiotics of Happiness, Rhetorical Beginnings of a Public Problem, and Significant Emotions, Rhetoric, and Social Problems in a Vulnerable Age. Ashley has also recently launched a podcast with Sublation Media, which we'll ask her more about. Ashley, welcome to the New Flesh.
Thanks so much for having me.
So I'd like to ask you a question that was posed to one of our previous guests, Dr. Jason D. Hill, who is a professor at DePaul University. Ashley, have you decolonized your syllabi?
That's a really funny question because I teach the origins of sociology. So I used to. I don't. Who knows? Maybe it's been decolonized now. The module was given up to someone else. But I used to teach Intro to Sociology, and I would teach its origins in the Enlightenment, and you know, the sort of build up or development of thought, you know, before the Enlightenment, and then sort of different ideas that led to the development of science, and then this idea that, well, we can apply science to solve all these human problems, all these medical problems, these biological problems. Surely we can, you know, apply science to society and solve its problems. And this becomes quite problematic, actually, because human beings are not like animals. I mean, we are animals, but we're different in really important ways, which I think tend to be forgotten, oddly enough, today. But so I used to teach this, and I had a meeting with somebody who said, you know, students these days with management type, you know, they're really pushing for us to decolonize our curriculum. And I just want to, you know, make sure that you go through your materials to make sure that you have a good balance and diversity. You know, there's nothing wrong with that, right? Like you can have a blind spot for certain things. And this kind of nudge can help you to kind of think, well, maybe I should look for different kinds of materials that will add maybe a different flavor to what I'm doing. I don't know. It's fine. But I just thought it was really funny because I'm Indigenous, right? And I'm Canadian First Nations. You know, I'm obviously like mixed with white, but like pale as a ghost. But I just found it really funny that this white British woman was sitting there telling me to decolonize my curriculum. And I said that to her, And she looked extremely uncomfortable, slammed the binder shut and went, okay, let's talk about something else. So I didn't have a lot of pressure on me to really, take that agenda any further. And I find the whole decolonization, I don't know what to call it, project paradigm. I mean, project makes it sound more coherent than it probably is. But this whole decolonization, I don't know, trend is a bit strange because it works like a lot of these things do in the public sphere, where because they are kind of disorganized, they lack a kind of coherence, but at the same time, they demand adherence. So if you push and you say decolonization, I mean, if I take that really seriously, like radical decolonization, there's a paper called Decolonization is Not a Metaphor. And the authors are like, oh, well, why does that make you feel uncomfortable? Well, it makes me feel uncomfortable because blood and soil nationalism doesn't really have a good history. And then if you kind of say that, like, what do you want? Like, you want ethno-states? And people go, oh, come on, it's just a metaphor, right? It's always this kind of slipperiness to it. So anytime you push back, people go, oh, it's not that big of a deal. But then if they want to be really radical, they'll say, this is a really, really big deal. Anyways, in my experience, it has not been that big of a deal. It's not been a massive kind of push on what I teach, and I've not felt a humongous amount of pressure.
But Ashley, what do you think of the idea of, because you said you've had to teach the Enlightenment and you've had to obviously engage with some.
I haven't had to. I've chosen to.
Well, you're careful with your language, and I shoot from the hip. So I absolutely, you've chosen to, and so you obviously have engaged with some pretty foundational texts that you think are of value. How, when you're asked to decolonize something, how is it possible to ever bring up meritocratic arguments? Is it ever possible to say, like, I can only give the example of, from English literature, for example, like if I met someone who tried to tell me that, Hamlet wasn't a masterpiece or something, or that there was something comparable to that from anywhere in the world, I like that I should be teaching to, a first year or whatever, I would probably say, well, I'd have to read it first. I'd say it'd be better on its face. You know what I mean? It better be as equal or greater to Hamlet. So, I mean, what do you think of that argument of being able to say, well, no, this text is pretty amazing and we should be grateful for it?
Well, I mean, yeah, I think education should be about teaching the best that's been written. But, I'm open to this, that's not been written, but that's been thought and said and so on. I'm open to the idea that I have blind spots, like I can't know everything. And I do welcome a push to kind of think about other ways of doing things. But this can kind of lead to some rewriting of history that's not super helpful. So you get this idea, like, people will talk, and this was starting to become an issue even 20 years ago when I was an undergraduate, where I remember my lecturers looking extremely uncomfortable and saying, look, I'm very sorry to tell you, I was studying anthropology and sociology. I double majored. And there's no such thing as a matriarchal society. There are matrilineal societies, but there are no matriarchal societies. And he was looking very uncomfortable saying this, already at that point. It was almost like you had to make something, you had to big up women in history. Okay, there's nothing wrong with the fact that, like, different societies, there's an enormous social and cultural difference around the world. And human beings are not slaves to custom or slaves to biology. That's the great thing about us. But there are certain things that have pushed societies to develop in particular directions. And we have the great benefit now of not being determined. Our society is freer probably than any other society has ever been to question these kinds of determinisms. But people in the past were not able really to do that. And so just by virtue of the structure and the necessity of the material conditions of these societies, women were really not able to have that much power. And they were not able, going forward into the future, to get education to the extent that men were. It's absolutely the case that the contributions of some women were downplayed. And people will say that even sociology was coined by a woman Who knows if that's true now? It's so hard to like trust these kind of like rewriting history, because you kind of go through history, you plunder history, and you look for evidence of some obsession that we have now that maybe wasn't there, and so then you can wind up rewriting history. So I hate these kinds of being invited to adopt these extremes. Like, I don't need to say like, oh, this is the very best, and like, oh, English literature in the 18th century was the very, very best. Yeah, okay, probably. Like, or like in Scotland or during the Enlightenment or in Europe. Yeah, probably, because the conditions were such that people were free to think in ways that they hadn't before. But other societies also had great works. I am open to reading those, and I am open to teaching those. But I'm not open to like then needing to sort of downplay everything else, because I think, and this is an old-fashioned idea, but I think we're all human beings, and therefore, the cultural heritage of humanity belongs to all of us. So I don't need to downplay so-called white people and their ideas, and I also don't need to downplay other cultures and their ideas. In fact, I do bring my own, like, I grew up with Ojibwe culture, obviously mixed with mainstream culture. It's not possible not to, because cultures are dynamic. But I do teach about the worldview that I grew up with. And I don't teach it like you have to believe this. It's just a different way of seeing things. They can help you actually to think critically about received wisdom. So I can draw from a huge range of outlooks, and I don't have to, just because people are losing their minds in the public sphere, go to these extreme positions like, oh, in the past, women, there were matriarchal societies, or like, oh, we need to stop teaching dead white men. Well, look, dead white men had a lot to teach while they were alive at the time, I suppose, lots of them. The revolutionaries, for instance, in a way, it winds up being a bit racist, because you deny the heritage of, for instance, the Enlightenment to people with darker skin, because you're saying, well, that doesn't really belong to you, but it does belong to all of us.
Yeah, you actually see this. You actually see this a lot in classical music. So you often hear, educators in high school saying, "Well, we can't really get, urban black and brown kids to listen to Mozart because, what does Mozart do for them? So they teach them rap music. Whereas I believe, and I think, as you were just saying, that these sorts of artworks, they belong to humanity, not just to a certain race of people."
And it goes the other way too. Like, there are lots of Indigenous artists who want to make art of all kinds, but find it very difficult to sell anything that isn't like polar bears, right? So this becomes an issue. And then on the other hand, there's a more recent development where I was, I'm part of like this Facebook group for my reserve. And I'm, I don't know, part of some other First Nations Facebook groups. And like every now and then they'll be like celebrating Indigenous designers. And over time, you see now a disclaimer: this designer only sells to Indigenous people. So now you're like condemned to being other and different forever. And if you want to be a mainstream designer, well, you're screwed now, like, because no one can wear. And like, I've got a beautiful pair of mucklucks that I got from like my aunt makes these. She used to own a craft shop in our reserve. They're really beautiful. I remember wearing them while I was teaching, the student looking at me a bit funny, and I had to like reassure him, oh, it's okay that I'm wearing these. Like he's looking at me like, are you racially pure enough to be wearing? Like, that's the kind of direction that we're going in. I think that's.
I know he was a cishet white guy. I just know it. I know that's who it was.
Probably, regrettably.
It's always me and my brethren who are most worried about whether you're pure enough. We're always like, I think it's like making up for. He knows he's already in the kill zone, so he's got to go like externalize and say, now I've got to be the biggest white knight on campus, otherwise I'm out.
Well, the thing is, like, as a human being, you can appreciate that these are beautiful. That the beadwork is gorgeous, that the like rabbit fur is soft and and that you've made this beautiful object that you've sort of, as a human being, we work on the world, we make things. And when we do that, we realize our humanity. It's like the most human thing that you can do. And to share that with other people is really great. And to say that you can only share it with particular people is to condemn people to particularity. And I think takes us backwards. Now, of course, there's a whole argument about like these big brands that will rip off indigenous designs and then people are wearing them. And I think that what winds up happening there is a misplaced distrust of capitalism for it's universalism, ironically, that it tends to sort of take things that were particular and massify them, this sort of romantic reaction to capitalism. I think that critique then gets sort of bound up with this more particular critique about designers and cultural appropriation and that sort of thing, which I think is more of a confused kind of anti-consumerist, romantic anti-capitalism that then gets bound up with our sort of current culture wars over race and ethnicity and so on.
Well, you mentioned that you're Canadian, and I'd like to know, is Canada the wokest place on earth?
Jesus Christ, it might be. It's unbearable. I find it harder and harder to go back there. I don't know. It's pretty. I don't know. It's neck and neck with New Zealand, I think.
Yes. Good call, Matt.
Yeah.
Very good call. I think we're third. We might be coming up the rear, but in Australia, but New Zealand and Canada. Tell us about Canada. Well, how did it get this way?
I'm not entirely sure, but I remember when I was an undergraduate, I said I studied sociology and anthropology. I graduated in 2007, my undergraduate degree. And I was really woke, like what you would consider woke now, definitely 100%. And thank God. And when I was in Canada, no one ever questioned anything that I said. So I would just spout this bullshit. And it was just like, I have this special knowledge that other people do not have. And it is my birthright, my right for having gone through this, that I will now administer to the problems of society that you plebs, because you don't have this knowledge, that you need. And I think my whole educational trajectory has been like a coming home, where I was sort of shaken out of, when I was 16, 17, I probably was much more aspirational, much more materialist. And going to university kind of shook that out of me and gave me this sense that the masses were the problem. And as I said, that I would now have this knowledge that I could administer to them. And over time, and a long period of argument and questioning and confrontation with other people with whom I very much disagreed, I began to change my mind. And I began to see a certain wisdom of the masses. And a certain wisdom that I had before it was beat out of me. And that I learned that, all this stuff about anti-consumerism, and that was the correct position to have. And the masses were all just too greedy and acquisitive and all this stuff. And I was like, oh, well, actually, living in squalor was pretty shite. And what's wrong with wanting nice floors in my house? And things, and I, what is it, Bill Haywood, nothing is too good for the working class. And this kind of understanding, this desire that people had was actually a sign of civilization, that you want more. The sign of the acquisitiveness of humanity is a sign of our fundamental progressiveness. But how did I come out of that? Well, I went to go do a PhD in the UK. And I remember the moment, actually. I went to a conference, first conference I'd ever really been to. And I was saying my stupid crap that I usually say, at the bar after the conference. And someone just looked at me and they were like, that's wrong. That's, you're talking nonsense. And it's this, this, and this. And I was shocked. Because before that, everyone just patted me on the back. Oh, well done, you're thinking. Good job. You're thinking different than the masses, and that was good enough for some stupid reason. I don't know. And no one had ever challenged me seriously. And my first instinct was to get mad. And I kind of went back to my hotel room and I thought about it and I plotted. I wanted to be right because I'm extremely stubborn. And the more that I read and the more that I looked into it, the more I realized that this person was right and I was wrong.
Wow.
And so then that's been like kind of my intellectual development, was that I don't know why, like we're just too damn polite in Canada to challenge each other. Or
do you think that's a rare experience, to be confronted just once and then I guess go on this journey of self-discovery and then find out that you were wrong? Because a lot of people would double down and just
write white fragility.
Yeah, there you go.
There's some things that I double down on. Like there's some things that I'm certain I'm right. But the more that I argue, the more that I see the weaknesses in my position, and I go and I shore them up, right? Or I abandon some of my positions. I think that's just, if I can do that as a human, all people can do that for the most part. I think it might be, I think it's what's happening now is that it's become a rarer and rarer thing. Because I mean, this is just the situation that we're in a highly pluralistic society. You are going to come across people with different interests and different beliefs and different constituencies. And there's pretty much no policy. I mean, there are very, very few policies that can come up that are just totally non-controversial. I mean, some group in society is going to have an issue. And so, this goes back to like basic kind of value conflict theory from the middle of the 20th century, which I'm a big fan of. And they're kind of, and it's Root and Weber as well, who I'm less of a fan of, but anyways, it's a good concept. So there are three kind of ways that you can, when you have these kinds of conflicts, you can come out of them. You can bargain, you can give up some things. So famously, abortion is one of these, what we call a position issue. Like the sides just cannot agree. And so you can wind up with this sort of stalemate, like people just won't change their minds. But you can bargain. And so in the UK, the policy is a result of that kind of bargaining where no side really got what they wanted fully. So the people who are anti-abortion, so we have this, I'm not sure if you're familiar, but you have to have the consent of doctors. It's not truly fully legal, but it is, like effectively it is. So the people who are anti-abortion can sort of content themselves that the society has not affirmed abortion as a value. And the people who are pro-abortion can sort of content themselves that it is de facto available on demand, with some caveats. All right, so this is bargaining. And that's kind of good. We've made some progress there. You can reach a consensus. You can kind of come to an agreement when sides lay their values out on the table. You can come to some kind of consensus. Or, and this is what I think is happening now, and this is the Weberian concept, you can exercise naked power. When there can be no bargaining and no consensus, when one side gets power, they just crush the other. And I think this is quite bad because in our society, as I said, very pluralistic, secular, policy requires legitimation. But policies that are founded on naked power tend to lack legitimacy. And so what winds up happening is when the other side gets in power, they just crush them. And so nobody actually winds up getting what they want. And I have been noticing now, and actually I just posted on Twitter, we got to start talking to each other because we're losing our freaking minds. And nobody wants to talk to each other. Nobody wants to have these debates, which for me was so formative. And just like getting real drunk and arguing until they kick you out of the pub. I think that's a great thing for humans to do, because you eventually have to kind of let go of some positions and see the other side. And so this isn't happening anymore. We keep saying there's more and more issues that people throw up where they say there's no debate. There can be no debate. And so we don't talk to each other. And what happens is, I know this is a bit of a cliche and everybody's been saying this, but we are becoming more polarized. And I think this isn't a good thing for a democratic society because, I care a lot about my trans students. I have a lot of trans students and I worry a lot about what might happen. I don't want to take the extreme position, but there are things that we have to talk about. We are talking about rather extreme changes to the way most people conceptualize things. And you can say, well, they shouldn't think of things that way, but they currently do. So we've got to have a conversation. And I think through that process of discourse, we can come to some kind of solution that isn't utterly freaking insane, because that is where we're going right now. Like, where both sides only want the most extreme positions, which is actually going backwards from where we had been before. So I was at sorry for going on. This is the last anecdote I'll give, I promise. I was at a public talk, and they were on stage, and someone was talking about Debbie Haywood. I'm not sure if I'm saying her name. Hayward? I can't remember. Apologies that I can't remember her name. But, she's a very thoughtful trans woman who talks about the difference between sex and gender and so on. And the people on stage were calling her he. And like, the thing is, she would agree with a lot of the positions that these people were putting up, right? And yet they keep calling her he. And then someone says, well, why do you call her a he? And they go, well, I think I have a duty to tell the truth. And I feel like this was kind of backward, because we had a tacit agreement in society that if someone was, even if you kind of suspected or something, you kind of saw it, you were like, oh, well, this person's clearly making an effort. They want to be a she. You might screw it up sometimes. It's quite unfortunate. But you kind of, said what you thought when you saw the person. This was, and I recognize this was kind of an issue because people were trying to pass and they couldn't always pass. And it's quite difficult for a lot of people. But there was kind of a tacit agreement in society. And now we're going back even on that sort of like basic kind of like how you present is, because that's how it works with most people. Like, how you present is what people will say. And now we're going back even on that. I want to know what's in your pants before I get the pronoun, or like what you were born with. Or it's just, I think that's a bit backward, actually. So I don't feel the need to take these kinds of extremes. And I think actually the fact that we are now doing that is the result of this naked power approach, where no one will talk to each other and we just seek to crush the other side.
Well, I have a concrete example from your work, actually, because, in that the gender critical space, or the trans space, or whatever you want to call it, there's a lot of criticism of Owen Jones. And I see a lot of clips of him online saying this and that. And I maybe had ingested a lot of this. And then I watched a conversation that you had with Owen Jones, and I was embarrassed about how much I loved hearing him speak at length, discoursing with you, away from that adversarial online tribalism. And so this was I think a great example of, I think we need more of exactly what you just said. I kind of want to speak to Owen. I want to get him on our show. I was like, oh wow, this is great. Like, I felt like I was embarrassed that I had bought into the
you wrote him off.
Well, some of our listeners actually will be hot under the collar about what I'm saying right now. But I stand by it.
Yeah, I want to talk to like the best people on an issue, on any issue. Like, I want to hear the best version of an argument. Like, I don't come to a position lightly. It takes me a long time to decide what I think of something. Like, I am an avowed Marxist. We'll run for the hills now. But
we'll get to that.
I didn't come to that position in a knee-jerk way. In fact, even as a super woke kid, when I finished my undergraduate degree, I didn't call myself a Marxist. I was only smart enough to know that I was dumb enough not to use that word, that I shouldn't use that. And it was only after I did like capital reading groups and debating endlessly, and also reading like Austrian economics, Schumpeter. I like Ayn Rand, by the way. I really like Atlas Shrugged. I mean, it's a terrible book, but I like the people who are criticizing the romantic anti-capitalists. I hate romantic anti-capitalism too, just as much as Rand does. But it's through this process of like questioning and looking at the other side, looking at what I thought were some of the best empirical studies, I kind of decided I think this is probably correct in terms of what's an understanding of what's happening in capitalism. That was the decision that I came to. So I can't make up my mind unless I hear the other side. And in fact, one of my favorite books, so there's a thing called the Temporal Single System Interpretation of Marx's Value Theory. And there's a debate book where it's like all the different sides of this debate, every chapter is them just rowing down, and they start getting like angry and bitter and stuff. But it's them like having it out with each other to figure out, is this the correct way to understand the world? And it matters a lot if it is the correct way. It's not just like, oh, I'm going to adopt this position because I don't want to get flamed online. Like, it matters that you understand the economics of a situation well, because when a crisis hits, for instance, this is devastating for humanity. We got to figure out how to deal with stuff like that. It matters that we get to the truth. So I want to talk to people, and I want to talk. Like I talked to James Lindsay yesterday. I just posted on this my most recent podcast was talking to James Lindsay, and I knew the people would want me to have him on and be like, throw down and have this debate. But I also knew that the more interesting thing is actually where we agree. There are obvious ways in which we disagree. And I actually had a really lovely, pleasant conversation with him, and he's a nice guy. He absolutely hates, communism and so on. There are things that he hates about Marxism or Marxists are things that I also can't stand. And the things that give him pause about the idea of Marx's idea of how society changes into socialism also give me pause, because I am realistic and serious, and I worry about the future. I'm not, the Soviet Union, I'm not going to say the Soviet Union was like the worst thing that ever happened to humanity, but it wasn't good. And I, if I'm being serious, we have to learn from the past, and I need to learn also from critics, and I need to listen, and I need to be ready to be wrong. And actually, as it turns out, we agreed on quite a lot. And I think these are kinds of fruitful conversations to have, instead of just trying to show each other up and look how cool I am, and look, I'm going to own this person. How stupid.
Well, seeing as we're on this topic, perhaps you could outline some of the features of Marxism, because I know we've got listeners who are like, I don't understand Marxism. I know I'm supposed to hate it, but I don't know what it is. Maybe you could school us on some of the features of Marxism.
Sure. So I think the thing that appeals to me most about Marx's work is his understanding of how capitalism works. And so this is the kind of thing that can irk me a little when you see people talking online where like Marxism doesn't work. And I'm like, what are you on about? Because Marxism is an understanding of capitalism. That's what capital is about. It's an engagement with political economists of Marx's time, trying to understand what is it that lies at the heart of this society. And he does what's called an immanent critique. So he takes people at their word. He doesn't start with greed or human frailty. He starts with the same rational liberal subject as Adam Smith does, for instance. And he shows how even if people act perfectly rationally, we still run into these problems, crises, and so on. And he tries to explain why that is. And so he comes up with this idea that the value, I'm going to go too deeply into this now, but the value of products in society comes down to the socially necessary labor time that goes into, on average, that goes into producing them. And this thing is Adam Smith also had a labor theory of value. Labor theories of value go back to, probably John Locke, but probably before that. He kind of added in and solved the puzzles that Smith and Ricardo couldn't solve. So Ricardo, for instance, was trying to tie value to things like corn. They need to peg it to something. And Marx showed that, they were kind of figuring it out. They were on their way there, but this is what's going on. And he called Smith and Ricardo true economists, because they were coming up at a time when capitalism was new and nascent and absolutely radical and revolutionary, which he agreed with. He saw capitalism as a positive revolutionary force. And he said they were true scientists because when first of all, they were just literally trying to figure out what is going on here, what is different in this system than what came before it. But also, when capitalism produced wealth, they championed it. And when it didn't, they didn't. They never apologized for it. And that distinguished them from the vulgar economists who began to apologize for capitalism. And he says, famously in the Communist Manifesto, capitalism is not an absolute system for the production of wealth, but at a certain point begins to fetter it, begins to hold humanity back. So that's the famous line. It produces a situation in all earlier epochs would have been an abstraction, a crisis of overproduction. And he doesn't mean overproduction in terms of use values, like useful things, because how can you have that when you have people starving in the world? He means that overproduction in the sense of what can be sold, which is absurd. this should be wonderful. This should be great for humanity that lived in toil and suffering for such a long time. Now we can produce this wealth and abundance, but it becomes a bad thing. And he says, this shows us it is not an absolute system for the creation of wealth, but begins to destroy it. So in crises, for instance, we have destruction of wealth. You have the situation where you don't have any bread because you got fired from the bread factory. Or you what is it? John Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath, where he has these like vivid depictions of like pouring lye on pigs during the Great Depression because they couldn't be sold profitably while people were starving, children were dying and stuff like that. You have this kind of situation. And Marx is trying to understand how that happens. And he's absolutely a champion of wealth and abundance, as if we could figure out how to unlock that from this step, this wonderful step that capitalism has taken us on. We need to move beyond that to what it is making possible. And if you read, so that's in just in the Communist Manifesto, but the Grundrisse, we just read Notebook 7 on sublation media. We were doing a reading group. If you read that, The Fragment on Machines, he's absolutely giddy about the possibilities of, what happened. That's what capitalism did is like, he has this idea of sublation, which is what we called ourselves sublation media, where you have like primitive communism or whatever, where you have a more direct relationship as a human being with what you produce in the world. So like, I'm a human being, I'm creative, I want to like kill a beast, so I fashion a bow and arrow and I kill the beast, I consume it, becomes part of me, who I am, and I give it to, I'm whatever. So it's subject, object are more or less directly linked. Subject being me, a human, object being the world. They come together when I create something and consume it. I realize myself and my creativity and so on. But Marx is not a fan of primitive communism. He doesn't want us to go back to that. Because what capitalism does, it breaks down that process. It alienates us. It separates us from the object of our creation. And everybody always stops there. They're like, oh yeah, Marx talked about alienation. We're alienated from our species being. We're alienated from the things that we create. That's so bad. No, he goes further. He says we become separated from our production, but as that happens, every aspect of the production process becomes so refined, so automated, so efficient, that they start to come back together, right? Where you think it and you create it, just like in primitive communism, except in a higher form. That's the sublation. So it's you destroy that creativity, but you because you're to get there, you have to be like an appendage of the machine for 200 years. But through that process, you then are able to realize your creativity in a higher form. So for instance, if you think about music, you might have played music throughout history. You would have fashioned all sorts of instruments, played it for people directly. And then the music industry, I've skipped ahead quite a lot, but just bear with me.
That was a Stanley Kubrick cut. Dawn of Man, just bang, we're in a spaceship.
It separates this, right, into all of these different things. Every sound becomes refined and so on. You had these music studios that were very, very expensive and everything was like fine-tuned. And now people make masterpieces in their bedrooms with a laptop. This is that separation and then the coming together that capitalism makes possible and does indeed produce. But then this becomes a bad thing for capitalism because you're like, oh no, like it was very hard to profit from that unless we can find some way to like put artificial walls up around it or whatever. So capitalism is always doing this. It's always creating this abundance that it then has trouble holding on to or confining. So Marx, again, in the Communist Manifesto, I hate to quote the Communist Manifesto because people are like, oh, it's the most basic text, but just read it and you will, if you actually read it, like the most basic things are there. So he says the capitalist is like the sorcerer who's unable to control the powers he's conjured up from the netherworld. And this is it, like you conjure up such extreme abundance, such wealth, and then you scramble to try to control it. And capitalism has a lot of trouble doing that. So what should free us, which should be a wonderful thing, turns around and becomes a bad thing. People are talking about AI now as like possibly producing all this calamity and so on. But it should be a good thing. And it is a good thing that we have this incredible technology. And I'm not talking about like just chatbots and stuff. All the different kinds of uses that people are putting this new computing power to are fantastic for humanity. It frees us from toil. But this then becomes a bad thing within capitalism. So what Marx is talking about is he's an incredibly progressive thinker. And he's like, what made me a Marxist, I think, makes me continue to be a Marxist, is I am more libertarian even than libertarians, because I want freedom, I want wealth, I want abundance for humanity. I want to free what capitalism creates but can't hold on to, even when capitalism destroys it. Even when capitalism tells me I can't have it, I will still demand it. And I think what happened was, so this is the historical Marx. This is what's in his writings. He's very much an individualist. He talks about egoism as the basis of communism in German ideology. Well, Engels says this in a letter to Marx when he read Max Stirner's work. He says, any egoist would become a communist of necessity. If you are truly an individualist, then, you will demand, like Oscar Wilde, for instance, in The Soul of Man Under Socialism. He says, the great thing about socialism is that it would free us from the sort of necessity of having to live for others. Because that's what you do now. You spend most of your life living for some asshole so he can go on live on a yacht. I want to live my whole life for me. And we have that possibility now. Like, by freeing people, because I don't have to sit on a log and pound millet for 8 hours a day, or like go fetch water. I've got like technology that does this for me. I am freer now to be an individual. That is what Marx is talking about. He wants to free that completely. Not completely. There's a certain amount of necessity that will always be with us. But it will be the idea is that it can be a much smaller part of the day during which we will have to do whatever necessary work, drudgery that people don't want to do, like cleaning sewers or whatever. But the rest of the time could be free. And capitalism produces that possibility. We already do that. We already work only like an hour to reproduce the stuff we need to survive, or 2 hours or whatever. Our what would cover our wages that we then go and spend in the supermarket. And then we spend the rest of the time working for somebody else. We could spend that time working for ourselves. So that's the idea. It's like radically individualist, radically pro-industrialism, pro-wealth, pro-abundance. And what happened was in the 50s, really as early as the 40s and probably before that, but definitely in the 50s, you had, in the sort of post-war boom, so-called Marxists began to reconceptualize wealth as the problem instead of the solution. That it was bad for your soul, that it made you too greedy and acquisitive. But if you read Marx, like, he talks about greed as a powerful force in our societies, that in earlier societies, it screwed people because they didn't have a way of investing back into production. So when they would go out, and they had a bit of money, money was circulating. So you're like, oh, money is the potentiality of all things. If I have this money, I can have everything. So you go out and you plunder and you bring back all this gold. And it just screwed everybody because it caused inflation. All that happened was slaves got more expensive. In our society, that's not the case. When you pursue money, abstract symbols of wealth, you do produce wealth accidentally. It's an offshoot. You're producing this abstract symbol of wealth, money. That's what you want when you invest in production. You don't give a shit about shoes or whatever you're producing. But you do produce an enormous number of shoes very, very cheaply. So he wasn't criticizing people for being greedy. He says greed is an incredible productive force within capitalism. But then this starts to get lost. And it becomes about capitalism is the problems of abundance. And there's too much individualism or whatever it might be. And this becomes...
How did we get to the point where, you're probably already almost there, but how did we get to the point where the word Marxist is basically a slur? You know what I mean? Like, I mean, even James Lindsay uses the word fairly liberally, you know what I mean, who you've just interviewed. So this is out there right now. So why, I mean, the way you talk about it, it sounds quite, I'm sort of jazzed up and it's quite inspirational. So what's the disconnect?
I think the disconnect happens, and I hate to be like feed into this, but a real wrong turn was taken with large portions of the New Left, partially the Frankfurt School, but definitely the New Left. But I think also, and what's left out of this story, okay, I have to give you two answers here, and I don't have a pen. Usually I write things down. There's sort of two things going on here. One is that the left kind of took this turn and began to give up on liberalism. And there's like this sort of like Stalin, this like residual Stalinism and this hatred for liberalism, instead of recognizing that Marxism is a continuation and sublation of liberalism. It's making it real in society. It's a critique of liberal rights that cannot possibly be realized within capitalism. So it's this kind of like anti-liberalism and like just this reaction to capitalism as opposed to a sublation of capitalism that becomes really powerful. And the second thing is that capitalism itself lost faith in itself and began to kind of superficially resemble some of these new left critiques, and indeed took them on as ideological clothing. And so I'll come back to that ideological clothing for capitalism in decline. But on that first point, like, how does Marxism become a slur? I'll tell you exactly how it happened. I was at a conference, and we were chatting, and there was a young person there, real keen, and she's talking about we're talking about free speech, and she's like, she could not understand why you would need freedom of speech in your own home. And she's like, and we were talking about, like, in the UK, there's a racist slur that some working class people use for convenience stores. And I'm not going to say it, obviously, but I'm not even I never even really heard it before. I wasn't totally familiar with what it was. But anyway, and I was like, well, like, in the privacy of your own home, and when you don't have the intent to hurt anybody, there's no and just in the privacy of your own home, whatever, say what you want. And she was like, well, why do people need to say racist things? Like, why do you even say that? And I was like,
great point.
That's stupid. Like, well, why do you need to do that? Is always the stupid answer of the authoritarian who doesn't want to admit.
Well, if you've got nothing to hide, then I mean, just you know, if we spy on you with your webcam while you're in bed with your wife, what's the difference? You've got nothing to hide.
Exactly. And it's like, well, because a lot of people will think like all sorts of crazy things, and then you have a discussion with each other, whatever. And like, it doesn't really affect anybody. But I don't even need to go into why. Like, it's like, do you really want a world in which you create and avow the most obvious dystopia, 1984? I
was going to say, as soon as you said the story, I pictured the video screen on the wall hidden behind the painting.
Why do you need to write I hate Big Brother? Like, why do you need to do that? Anyway,
that's right.
And then as we have this conversation, she proudly exclaims that she's a Marxist. And I went, oh, because Marx famously was in favor of freedom of the press. You know, he talked about how, like, he desires this freedom like the desire, the deepest desire of the soul, you know? And how far we've traveled, that this student clearly had not read anything seriously could say, well, that's a Marxist position. You know, she just off the top, I'm a Marxist, right? Oh, I'm learned. And I was like, Jesus Christ, how embarrassing for all of us. So that Marxism becomes this kind of stand-in for these complete repudiations of his ideas, and like anti-liberalism, partially through the New Left, partially because of Stalinism and all these sorts of things, that they became very, very anti-liberal. And then the second thing, as I said, was that, capitalism begins to lose faith in itself. And so you have a period of decline in which, the idea that economic growth was going to be a solution to all these social problems starts to be done away with. So there was this idea, famously, like Rostow's stages of growth, where you have that all societies are going to pass through these stages, and you go from like, basically toil to these advanced consumer societies. And as you do that, you have a convergence of values. And eventually we're all just going to live in these like advanced liberal societies. All you need to do is kind of put the correct economic policies in place, and there will be like peace and love and joy in the world. And, this obviously didn't happen. And so, all the way, in the 1960s, you start seeing people in power questioning this. And they didn't question it because they were like, oh, growth is great and wealth is wonderful and so on, but I'm kind of concerned about the soul. No, they questioned it because growth liberalism wasn't working. That societies were not in the developing world, we're not developing along the same path that liberal Western countries were developing. And so growth liberalism was abandoned. This idea of like capitalism as this dynamic system that's going to, raise living standards. It was abandoned not because people had a change of heart, but because it wasn't happening. And this is what I talk about in my first book, that part of the reason why there was this shift, this attempt amongst very well-to-do people to shift away from wealth and abundance and to sort of downplay all of that, was because of a dim awareness of stagnation within capitalism. So people like idiots who don't know anything about capitalism think that it's just growth. That's what it is. It just grows and grows. What a terrible system that makes us so rich. Oh, it's awful. We're just going to get richer and richer and richer forever. Oh, terrible. And oh, well, maybe it'll destroy the planet. But if that was the case, there'd be no reason to be against capitalism. Fine, like, I don't know, let's do something about the environment. But like, if it's, totally solvable within capitalism, I think. The issue is that capitalism is both a dynamic system that needs to grow and also runs up against limits, internal limits to its own growth. You have, a dampening down of incentives to invest and actually produce things in society. Like you have, and this is, again, one of Marx's ideas, that fall the rate of profit, but it wasn't his idea. The idea that profit rates tend to fall, leading to stagnation and destructive crises, was taken for granted in the 19th century. It was a puzzle that needed solving. And Marx saw himself as trying to solve that puzzle, or having solved that puzzle. He didn't create the idea of declining profit rates. And since then, this is what I was saying before I read empirical studies, and I was pretty convinced by them. I think that this idea that there is a declining profit rate is probably correct. And I think that this is perceived by people in power. But just like John Stuart Mill, who Marx calls like a vulgar economist, when he saw capitalism undermining its own dynamism, its own ability to produce wealth, he's tried to harmonize it. He tried to say, well, maybe it's this harmonious stationary state where we just reproduce the same thing forever and ever, to which capitalism is naturally advancing. And Marx is like, no, you're just harmonizing what is an incredibly destructive force. And so I think that's what's happening now, is that people in power see that capitalism is undermining its own growth and stagnating, and they're trying to harmonize that. And they're like, oh, it's fine. You'll own nothing and be happy. Don't worry. We'll have a sharing and caring economy and all this bullshit. And it's their own limited elitist utopia in which they still get to live the lives that they like, and us plebs get less, and we won't clog up their beaches. This is what James Lindsay said that I completely agreed with. And it's actually one of my own talking points that I was surprised to hear come out of his mouth, was that, those in power, they can't stand when those things that were special and particular to them get massified, and the plebs get to enjoy them too. They want to go back to a world in which, we will live only on as much as is serviceable to our masters, and we'll be happy doing it. And that gets mixed up with Marxism, but it's completely antithetical to what Marx actually said. Although it does, through 60 years of quasi-Marxist academic theory, has become the sustaining ideology of capitalism. But if you actually read Marx, it's very contrary to what he was actually arguing. Because they see struggle, and they're just like, class struggle, which is so important. They're like, well, maybe we just get rid of class. We'll put the word gender in, or maybe we'll just no, it has to be class. It's like, it's not like you can just take out the parts and fit something else in. No, then you come up with I'm sorry, but that's what the Nazis did, right? They were they called themselves socialists because they superficially took on all this. Well, first of all, because the language of socialism was powerful at the time, and everybody wanted to call themselves socialists. I think is what's happening now with the word left. Who is it? Oswald Spengler said, oh, what is this? Call it socialism, whatever. What do I care? What do words matter? It's the same kind of thing. Now people want to call themselves leftists, who have espoused ideas that are totally contrary to, the left side of the French Revolution, for instance, that are much more sort of the left wing of what was the right wing romantic reaction to the Enlightenment. So yeah, anyways, go on. You wanted to ask me a question.
Just to pick up on something you said there, like this idea of rich people or sort of the new aristocratic class trying to shut people out of particular places, you know, they get annoyed when they see, you know, I guess the masses can now say have travel, you know, world travel. Do you think that's the reason why a lot of people like, you know, even like the royal family in the UK jumping on the bandwagon of environmentalism as a way of, you know, of separating themselves again, because they can offset their air travel quite easily, whereas, you know, us plebs can't do that.
Yeah, I mean, that's part of it. Romantic anti-capitalism is, Marx writes in the Grundrisse, his notebooks, that the romantic viewpoint, you know, capitalism never got past the romantic viewpoint, and it will accompany it as its legitimate antithesis up to its bitter end. What that means is that this kind of questioning is capitalism's legitimate antithesis. It's like confines of acceptable critique. And so it's this, as I said, this questioning of things as it becomes massified, which ironically becomes a driver for new rounds of capitalist accumulation. So people will, well, just in a basic way, like they're constantly searching for something new, some new experience that the plebs haven't destroyed yet, this kind of thing. So that's you know, that's always been part of capitalism. I think the other part of it is what I was saying before, that there is this dim realization that there is stagnation within capitalism, and there's an attempt to harmonize that and to say, no, this is just, it's not a limit to capitalism, it's an external limit, and we all just have to accept it. And that sounds kind of leftist for some reason. Well, if you go back to like the French Revolution, where left and right initially came from, this is much more of a right-wing position, because the right wing was about, you know, order. Now like law and order become like safety. That's the new sort of, but what about safety and well-being? This is safety and well-being are the new law and order, basically. So if you go back that far, these are very, very right-wing ideas, but they become kind of quasi-leftist sounding when the left has lost that kind of dynamism, when it's given into this notion that capitalism has actually gone too far, whereas for Marx it hasn't gone far enough. And so no one's really been, and of course there was like this internal questioning where academics argued that the fall in the rate of profit is a myth, that it's not actually true. In fact, there's a tendency for profits to rise. And so on the left, people think, oh, well, the real problem is that, you know, bankers are too greedy and corporations are too greedy and they're just not sharing out the wealth, as opposed to the fact that there is less, as a percentage of rate, there's less profit to be made, which means that people have less incentive to invest. So there's that critique no longer exists on the left. We're not able to make it anymore because supposedly it's been discredited and forgotten. I think I'm probably one of like seven Marxists who are like, no, the falling rate of profit is extremely important and it explains a lot of what's going on here. But I think those empowered do recognize that. But because they can't see beyond the present, this is just the best of all possible worlds. There's no alternative. What can they do? They have to say, this is a real limit. It's an ecological limit. We all just have to accept it.
So Ashley, I love talking about this. This is the left I want back. I want this. This is material. This is profit. This is the bottom line. This is about, like, you know, I don't know, the fat controller, you know, and how much he's screwing us all and all that stuff. But instead, the left seems more concerned. I mean, you haven't mentioned Marx's kinks at all, and which is, I mean, pretty much all people would be talking about now. They'd be like talking about what Marx liked to get up to at night, whether he was a furry or whether he was a power bottom or something like that, you know? So, I mean, this hasn't come up at all, which is great, you know?
Well, here's the thing, like, I think Engels was a little bit more kind of going in that direction, but there's this great anecdote. And every time I bring up this anecdote, no one believes me. So I'm going to next time I talk about it, I'm just going to give the source, but I haven't been able to refine the source, but it is true. Take my word for it. But you can go look it up yourselves. But Marx famously, he went to Paris when he was sort of in exile. And there's this anecdote where he kind of meets these communists, which would be the equivalent of today's hippies. And they're talking about like free love and stuff. And he's kind of disgusted by them.
That's good. He should be. He should be like, you guys are gross. Like get back to work and, building the beautiful vision of the future and not just thinking about your genitals.
Yeah, and like Lenin complained about that as well, that young people were at the time, very obsessed about sex and that sort of thing. They'd lost sight of like materialist analysis. I think, yeah, they just, I think, I don't know, this sort of inability to look beyond the present, I think leads to this deep desire to find fulfillment now, right? And I think that comes up, I don't know, I suppose it comes up in like well-to-do classes in the 19th century. And there's a powerful side to that as well. Like there's a progressive side to that too. I won't deny that. But it also kind of speaks to a certain amount of presentism when that's the only thing. And you see that as the lead for your movement is like an individual, like sexual emancipation. So I always joke like socialism
20 years
in
ago,
one
though. But you would remember being politically active 20 years ago and being on the left. And if you were out at a pub and this came and sex stuff came up, like everyone there in your gang would have been cool with it. They would have been like, oh yeah, okay. But it wouldn't have been at the top of the newsletter. Like it wouldn't have been, you wouldn't have had to wear badges about it and talk about it endlessly. And, you would have been marching against the war and a range of other things and not necessarily just saying I'm non-binary.
Yeah. So it's become sort of the headline of a movement when it seems as though anything beyond the self is impossible. And I said like the basis of communism is this kind of individualism, that is this freedom of the individual, but that can only be fully realized when we fully socialize production from a Marxist perspective. So capitalism already socializes production. Capitalism is a highly socialized system of production. What that means is that how we produce things is given over to society. So you don't have to like go and grow your coffee beans, dry them, maybe even run them through the intestinal tract of a goat or whatever. You don't need to do any of that. You can go buy them in a shop, put them in a coffee machine, press a button, grind them up if you've got a fancy schmancy machine. And like that's an enormous amount of your time that you no longer have to spend reproducing a cup of coffee that you can now spend on something else. So we're free within capitalism, but we're not fully free. We're freer than we've ever been. You're not, in feudalism, you were born a peasant, you died a peasant. That was pretty much it. And now you are free to, be born whatever, and you can become an entrepreneur. Now, not everybody can do that by definition. Some people will be workers and some people will employ people. How capitalism works. And so only in this full socialization production, which capitalism itself is tending toward, we just haven't figured out how to liberate that yet. We've never figured out how to move beyond the market, even though capitalism itself is moving beyond the market. We've not figured out how to do that. And so it's a big issue. And we got to sort this out. And we tried and we failed. The USSR was never able to move beyond the law of value. That is how things are valued, not subjectively. I mean, like the economic basis of value in capitalism, like they were taking price indices. They had to steal price indices from capitalist states to figure out how to price things. So they were never really, and they knew that too. They knew this. So there were like books produced in the Soviet Union called The Law of Value in the Soviet Union. So we've never been able to move beyond that. It's a big issue. Like capitalism is producing something else. But we are not able to take control of it, and therefore might produce something much, much worse. So this is the whole neo-feudalism thesis that some people are starting to talk about. It's producing something else, but there's no human hand on it. There's no control over it. It's just these people harmonizing like, oh, there's all these new things are coming up, but don't worry, they'll be fine. I'm still going to have my power. You're going to have your Amazon chits, and it'll all be fine. Anyway, so these are like wicked issues, right? And since the fall of the Berlin Wall, we've not really been able, we've more or less imbibed the idea that there is an alternative to capitalism. And in that space, the sphere of influence becomes really small. And it just becomes just here, right around your body. And that's it. And that's where you are also invited to enact your resistance, is in your body and yourself. So that's pretty different from how human beings have historically lived. For most of human history, the anchor for meaning was beyond the self. It was in something in the future, even like for religion, everything derived its meaning from something, in the higher world, in God or whatever. Or like, even like Marxism, it was this future-oriented kind of movement. But now the anchor for meaning is inside, in you. And everything, that's where truth is. That's where, it's this kind of also this reaction where all that is solid melts into air. And so you search for something solid, you search for something firm, and you say, well, it's in my body, it's in myself. So you see, even in these like what seem to be highly constructionist kind of ideas around gender, the more that you look into them, the more they become essentialist. So they want to be constructionists. That is, they want to say like, oh, everything is a social construct. But then they wind up saying, but this thing that I want is not a social construct. So they have to say like, oh, but my identity is something intrinsic to who I am. And they can't really go any deeper than that, because that's it. That's where the anchor for meaning is. They need something solid to hold on to, instead of like embracing this fact that all that is solid melts into air. And yeah, okay, if everything is a social construct, that doesn't release you from anything. It means as a society, we have to decide how we're going to live. We have to decide what constructs we're going to live by, how we're going to govern ourselves. And there's nothing that can make that choice for us. Not our biology, nothing. I mean, to a certain extent, obviously, biology is going to determine you're going to die, and like women produce babies, this sort of thing. Like there's a certain amount of biology that's always going to be there. But how we make sense of that, how we decide to live within that, is up to us. We have to make those kinds of decisions, which goes back to what I was talking about at the very beginning, that this will lead to kinds of conflicts, and we have to sort those out. And our society gives us very little firm grounding with which to do that. Throughout most of human history, people didn't need to think about those things. It was given to them by tradition. And now we don't have that tradition. And so instead of sort of embracing that human hand on history and saying, no, it's us, it's always been us, it was never God directing things, and now we can embrace the fact that it is us, humanity, that makes the rules and makes the judgments about how we're going to live. We exist in this unparalleled freedom at the same time as we have destroyed the subject capable of living in that freedom. So we have this idea like, oh, human beings are just a plague on the planet. We're just animals. And that's like a progressive thing to say. Oh, how are we actually really different from animals? I don't know. I'm fucking talking to you right now. That's a pretty big difference.
Yeah.
A highly complex symbolic order around myself. Pretty big difference. Instead of embracing that, we have this very weak idea of what it means to be human. So in that situation, you will search for these kinds of forms of solidity in the self, in your identity, in your whatever, that seem really firm. But they will also melt into air.
Well, actually, we're very mindful of time now. We have pages of questions we haven't got to. So please say you'll come back sometime so we can dive into those ones. But perhaps before we let you go, can you tell us about your podcast and what your vision is for it?
Sure. So I it's funny because I just interviewed Simon Evans the other day, and I was really nervous because that's only my second interview for my own podcast. And I read this book, as I always have to do a literature review on everything. Like, I can't just live my life. I got to do a thorough literature review and then decide how I'm going to proceed. So I read a few books about journalistic, and I think things I already know because I study social media. I studied the media, news media, and so on. But it was interesting hearing it from the horse's mouth. So I kind of thought, oh, well, I should be a journalist. And I forgot, actually, I'm not a journalist. And I just want to talk to people. So I kind of messed up. I started talking to Simon and we were laughing, talking, having this great conversation. I was like, oh no, I'm supposed to ask questions.
Yes.
And I ruined the interview totally by being like, so what are you working on now? And stupid cliche questions. Anyway, so I'm just having conversations with people with whom I disagree and with whom I agree. And I want to test the corners and the boundaries of things that I accept, that other people accept. And I want to talk across divides, because we're not talking to each other and we're all going nuts. And that's and I just hate this idea that I felt it myself doing sublation media. I feel like because we have a largely very homogenous audience, I sometimes feel like, oh, maybe I shouldn't say that because I'm going to alienate people. And then I'm like, why? That is so un-Ashley. How could I possibly be? So I felt like I need to do something more mainstream with just with a hope to reaching more people, where we can talk to each other even if we have opposing views, and we can be civil. And I think that's so, so important. And maybe, okay, sometimes we might throw down. I don't know. But I'm not that kind of person.
we don't like that stuff. It's gross.
No.
We talk about this all the time, because there's some of our, shall we say, more successful competitors, think they're journalists, and they say stuff like, oh, I've got to push people on this and push them on that, and
push back
and challenge them. And I'm like, do you? I mean, can't you just get them to say their piece and the audience can figure it out?
Exactly. And that's first of all, because I'm nice and I don't want to invite someone to come and talk to me and then be rude to them. I just can't can't possibly do that. But also I trust the audience, and I want to get, and like I might put forward the question where I'm like, well, I want to know, I can hear people saying, well, what about X? I'll put that question up. I'm not going to try to own somebody. I want to put forward the argument in its best form and then let other people judge. So I just did a series for Sublation Media on neo-feudalism, and I wanted to get left and right views. And I don't have a view myself. I'm just interested. I don't know I have no idea. I haven't decided. So I wanted them to convince me. So I invited who I thought were some of the best figures, the most interesting figures, the popular figures, to convince me. And I just kind of let people talk. And I said, well, what about this? What about that? And at the end,
you've made yourself the emperor in that little scenario, though. You're in that little diorama. They've got to entertain you, and you get to sit there and say, I choose you. Your ideas are good.
No, the thing is, I still haven't decided. It's going to take me years to do that. So I just don't, and also the way that I am is I kind of pick. I hear different kinds of ideas, and they make me think about other things. Like I don't know. Everyone wants you to condemn or judge or put forward.
Own the libs.
Yes.
Hot takes.
And I don't have a take. I'm not going to have a take. I think that what's going on here is they are touching on some kind of transition that's happening. Now, it's for my own thought, my own thinking to decide what that is, which would probably take a completely different form than condemning the neo-feudal thesis, And that's kind of my goal, is to further
I've heard Ashley's podcast. It's fantastic. I want everyone to listen to it. And she never, as she just said, it's very nuanced. It's got great guests. And I've never heard her just get up and say, what's the deal with all these trans toilets? She doesn't do that. So go somewhere else for that. Right? Where can people find you online, Ashley, if they want to engage with you?
Sure. So you can find me on Twitter at Ashley A. Frawley. I'm usually Ashley A. Frawley on everything. So YouTube, Ashley A. Frawley, Patreon, Ashley A. Frawley. I write every week. I write what I'm working on, what I'm thinking about, the different concepts that I'm kind of using. That's all on Patreon. And then the second half of my conversations are all on Patreon as well. Because I got to eat and I got a young family, all right?
Capitalism, baby.
I know. I can't.
Thank you very much, Ashley.
Yes, thank you.
Oh, wait, we got our last question. We almost blew the last question.
Oh, yes.
Ricky.
Ashley, we have a question we ask all of our guests at the end of the interview, and we'd like to know what you're reading right now.
Oh, do you know, I actually have started trying to read more for pleasure. So I'm on a kick of, I really like histories of random objects. I like books with no plot. And
called
so I just
Salt or something. Or...
Yes. Oh, I love that. Like history of tea, preferably many different things. So I just finished a book called Medieval Woman, which is just totally stupid. But it is totally plotless, like everyday life of a woman in the 12th century, and just what it was like, how she would go get water and like infant mortality. Love that kind of stuff. I want like a plotless book about Çatalhöyük, for instance. Like, I just want a plotless book about daily life in Çatalhöyük. Write it for me, please, world. That's what I'm looking for right now. So that's what I'm doing. I'm reading about like a history of random objects.
Fascinating. Always love to hear it. No one ever says the same thing whenever we say, what are you reading?
That's true. That's true.
No one ever says, I don't know, like
50 Shades of Grey.
Or yeah, just some pot boiler or something. Or
Yeah.
no, never. It's always something amazing.
Eat, Pray, Love.
Yeah, well, you're dating yourself there. Okay. Thank you, Ashley.
Thank you so much. Thanks. Bye.
Thank you for listening to the New Flesh podcast. If you like our work, please consider rating us on Apple Podcasts or even writing us a review. It really does help the show reach a wider audience. We'll be back with another episode next week. Until then, long live the New Flesh.